Property Talk by Steve Van Derodar. Rent stabilization. There's nothing new learning about rent stabilization. Rent stabilization in New York City is a form of rent regulation that protects tenants from sudden and excessive rent increases while ensuring landlords receive a fair return on their properties. Rent regulation that aims to protect tenants from sudden and excessive rent increases, while also ensuring landlords receive a fair return on their properties. The system is designed to provide stability to tenants and preserve affordable housing in the city. Here's an overview of how rent stabilization works in New York City. Key features of rent stabilization. Eligibility criteria. Buildings and apartments, generally. Rent stabilization applies to buildings with 6 or more units built before January 1st, 1974. It can also apply to newer buildings that receive certain tax benefits. Vacancy decontrol. If a stabilized apartment becomes vacant and the legal rent exceeds a certain threshold, as of 2021, $2,733.75 per month, it may become deregulated. However, recent changes in the law have made it harder to deregulate apartments. Rent increases, guidelines. The Rent Guidelines Board (RGB) sets the annual allowable rent increases for stabilized apartments. These guidelines consider various factors, including landlords' operating costs, inflation, and housing supply and demand. Lease renewals. Tenants in stabilized apartments have the right to renew their leases and are entitled to renewals under terms and conditions that conform to the RGB guidelines. Security of tenure, eviction protection. Tenants in rent-stabilized apartments can only be evicted for specific reasons, such as non-payment of rent, violating the lease terms, or the owner needing the apartment for personal use. Succession rights. Family members living with the tenant may be able to take over the lease if the tenant moves out or passes away. Legal rent, rent registration. Landlords must register the rents of stabilized apartments with the Division of Housing and Community Renewal (DHCR) annually. Tenants can request rent histories to check for overcharges. Rent reductions. Tenants can apply for rent reductions if the landlord fails to provide essential services or make necessary repairs. Major capital improvements, MCI, and individual apartment improvements, IAI, MCI, landlords can apply to DHCR for rent increases to cover the cost of building-wide improvements, such as new roofs, boilers, or elevators. IAI, landlords can raise the rent for individual apartment improvements with the tenant's consent. However, recent reforms have limited the amount and frequency of these increases. For example, say Maria, a single mother who has experienced the profound benefits of New York City's rent stabilization system. Her journey is a testament to how rent stabilization can provide residents stability, security, and a sense of community. Maria's rent-stabilized 2-bedroom apartment meant she could afford a safe and comfortable home without spending most of her income on rent. The predictable and regulated rent increases allowed her to plan her finances better and save for the future. With rent stabilization, Maria had the assurance that she could renew her lease each year. This stability was crucial for her son, who could remain in the same school and build lasting friendships without fearing moving due to unaffordable rent hikes. Rent stabilization in New York City is a complex system designed to balance the needs of tenants and landlords while maintaining affordable housing. It involves a web of regulations and protections that have evolved over time to address the city's unique housing challenges. Living in a rent-stabilized building meant that many of her neighbors had been there for years. This created a close-knit community where residents looked out for each other. Maria felt a strong sense of belonging and safety, knowing her neighbors and the local community well. Maria knew that as long as she adhered to the lease terms, she was protected against unjust eviction. This security allowed her to focus on her job and her son's education without worrying about losing her home. The building occasionally faced maintenance issues, and some landlords might have been reluctant to invest in rent-stabilized properties. However, Maria and her neighbors actively worked together, forming a tenants association to address these issues collectively. They communicated with the landlord, applied for rent reductions when necessary, and ensured that the building remained a safe and comfortable place to live. Maria's story is just one example of how rent stabilization can make a profound difference in the lives of New Yorkers. It gave her the stability needed to pursue her career goals, raise her son in a supportive community, and contribute positively to society. Recent reforms and changes. In 2019, New York State passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, HSTPA, which introduced several significant changes to rent stabilization laws. Elimination of high rent deregulation. The threshold for deregulating apartments was removed, making it harder for landlords to convert stabilized units to market rate. Limits on MCI and IAI increases. The law imposed stricter limits on rent increases for major capital improvements and individual apartment improvements. Enhanced tenant protections. The law provided stronger protections against harassment and retaliation, and extended the time tenants have to challenge overcharges. Benefits and challenges. Benefits, tenant protection, rent stabilization provides tenants with security and predictability regarding their housing costs. Affordable housing. The system helps preserve affordable housing stock in a high-demand market like New York City. Challenges, landlord incentives. Critics argue that rent stabilization can discourage property maintenance and improvement investment. Market distortions. Some believe rent stabilization can create market distortions, leading to a mismatch between supply and demand. Rent stabilization in New York City is a complex system designed to balance the needs of tenants and landlords while maintaining affordable housing. It involves a web of regulations and protections that have evolved over time to address the city's unique housing challenges. Understanding these rules is essential for both tenants and landlords to navigate the rental market effectively. In addition, rent stabilization in New York City is more than just a policy. It's a lifeline for many families. It offers affordability, security, and a sense of community, allowing residents to build better lives for themselves and their families. It is important to understand the importance of preserving and strengthening rent stabilization laws to ensure that more people can benefit from its stability and security. About the author. In New York City, Stevenson is affiliated with Ella Grant Forbes Global Properties as a real estate advisor and licensed real estate salesperson. Forbes Global Properties is a global network of elite real estate professionals, including brokers, developers, and agents, who specialize in luxury properties. Through Forbes Global Properties, members can connect with affluent buyers and sellers across the globe and showcase their high-end properties on a global stage. Stevenson is both a member of the Real Estate Board of New York REBNY and the National Association of Realtors, NAR. Email him at Derodar@ellagran.com.